I think the law just represents, it's so vague that it's the perfect conduit for the moral panic of an era. So in the 90s and the 80s, it was crack houses and properties of Black people. And then in the 2000s, it was parties, because that was the moral panic of the day. And then now it's supervised injection site, and tomorrow they'll find a reason to apply that on Juul or whatever, right? Because you find what you're panicking about and you apply the statute to.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
Hello, Narcotica listeners. Welcome to the program. I'm Troy Farah, beaming to you from the high desert, and we've got big news for you all. On Wednesday, October 2nd, a federal judge ruled that Safehouse, a proposed supervised consumption site in Philadelphia, does not violate federal law. This is a big win for the harm reduction movement, but the fight is far from over. Before we get into all that, we want to tell you about the upcoming International Drug Policy Reform Conference in beautiful St. Louis this November. There will be thousands of people there dedicated to one cause, ending the disastrous war on drugs that is in all reality just a war on people. The conference is from November 6th to November 9th, and Narcotica will be there with stickers and stuff, all thanks to our generous patrons who make this program possible. Go to reformconference.org now to learn more about the International Drug Policy Reform Conference in St. Louis, November 6th to 9th. And by the way, if you go into the Narcotica archives, we covered the topic of supervised consumption back in episode 4 with Laura Thomas, formerly of the Drug Policy Alliance, and we discussed how the Department of Justice has threatened to go after anyone who opens up one of these sites that led to this court case and this decision. It's a pretty good episode, although we sound a lot better now, so go check it out. Today on the show, we've got Narcotica co-host Zachary Siegel beaming in from Iowa City, and Chris Maraff in Philly, with Abraham Gutman, an editorial writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer who has been covering the topic of supervised consumption for a while. Everyone, welcome to the program.
Hello. So now the DOJ is saying they're, quote, disappointed in the court's ruling and will take all available steps to pursue further judicial review. Any attempt to open illicit drug injection sites in other jurisdictions while this case is still pending will continue to be met with immediate action by the department. And so that's a quote from the DOJ, which is basically legalese for don't open an injection site because we'll sue your ass.
So Abraham, can you give us some basic background on this fight in Philadelphia and why it isn't over yet?
Yeah, Phil, thank you so much for having me. This is like a big thing on my bucket list to be on my favorite podcast. So this is huge for me. So thank you. So this whole started obviously a long time ago with a lot of harm reduction activists who have been pushing for this for years, if not decades. But the formal story starts in January of 2018 when the city of Philadelphia gives this kind of confusing announcement that they're going to give a green light to entities, private entities, to open a supervised consumption site, but the city itself will not operate it, nor will give any funding towards it. So half of the city heard, we're not going to actually do this. The other half of the city heard, it's opening right now in your own home and you're paying for it. A lot of outrage, a lot of anxiety, a lot of misunderstanding, and a ton of misinformation in the upcoming month. But kind of like every conversation, without any development that was seen on the ground, the conversation kind of subsided away until October of 2018, when former Pennsylvania governor, Philadelphia mayor, Ed Rendell announced that he is joining forces with two of kind of some of the most prominent harm reduction leaders in Philadelphia, Jose Benitez, who is the executive director of the city's only syringe exchange prevention point, and Rhonda Goldfein, who is the executive director of the Pennsylvania AIDS Law Project. And they're going to open a nonprofit that will open a supervised injection site. And again, all hell broke loose because people heard in your home today, people are giving away drugs. And a few months after, in February, Trump appointed U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, William McSwain, decided to file a lawsuit asking a judge with no court case, with no hearing, just, to declare this an illegal activity. Safehouse said, we want a hearing. Judge said, seems reasonable. And then in the summer, in August, we had an evidentiary hearing in which there was a discussion about what a safe house would look like. And then in September, we had oral arguments in which each side argued with the judge about the merits of the law, not the merits of the policy. And then yesterday, we got a ruling.
Yeah, thank you for that. That brings us up to speed. And so that ruling, like, Troy was said in the intro, is that basically like Safehouse does not violate this, obscure provision of the Controlled Substances Act called the Crack House statute. And it's big, right? Like Chris, you're on the ground in Philly and you're talking to a lot of people about this. What's the vibes in Philly like after this ruling?
Yeah, well, so I've been pretty much on this from the beginning, and I guess I would go a little bit further back to the Mayor's Opioid Task Force, which convened in 2017, and sort of punted this issue of supervised injection. And that conversation was reignited by the campaign of DA Larry Krasner, who really brought the opioid crisis or the overdose crisis front and center. Without Krasner's election, I'm not sure if the mayor would have switched on this. In fact, at the press conference, it was really quite an ad hoc sort of press conference. The mayor wasn't even there. His managing director was there. They weren't really prepared to answer questions like the one I asked, which was, so basically you're saying somebody could open one of these tomorrow and you'd be okay with it? And it was kind of, a non-answer response. So I think that the administration felt pressure by the election of Krasner to make a move. And they went shortly thereafter to Vancouver. Now, I spent a lot of time prior to that among sort of young harm reduction activists that were planning on doing this anyway. Among the more interesting things to come out of the hearing, I think it was the second hearing, was, this dialogue on when, there's sort of plausible deniability, which was a big discussion around the doctors and nurses and activists that were putting this together, one of the things that came up, the judge actually mentioned himself, which was, is it illegal if you have a service site over here and then somebody goes over there across the street in the park and and that was one of the sort of loopholes that was being explored. Then Krasner was elected, the dialogue changed a little bit. And, I think that Jose Benitez and Prevention Point were always really looking towards this. But they were very, very, very quiet on the issue for quite some time, and left it to more radical elements of the youth community to kind of take the lead. And full disclosure, I'm working on a documentary on the coming into being of Safehouse. So I've been spending a bit of time around Jose and Rhonda as well. So I guess, would you like to add anything to that I missed, Av?
Yeah, first of all, I can't wait to see that documentary. And yeah, I agree. I think that the task force is really important. They brought, I don't have it in front of me, but I believe 17 recommendations or a large number of recommendations. One of them was supervised injection site. They also got a study done, a cost-benefit analysis that, in my opinion, showed very, very conservative estimates. I think it was something between 25 to 75 lives saved for one site with a few booths. It also showed that there's a lot of cost savings. And obviously we all are familiar with the type of, infections that were prevented, hospitalizations and all that. I do think it's just for listeners who are not from the Philadelphia area, and mainly actually listeners who might be in Canada or abroad elsewhere, I think it's really important to understand how big the crisis is here in Philly. So the announcement came in January of 2018. 2017, we had 1,200 people die of an overdose in Philadelphia, which is, that's like 3 to 4 a day of people dying of overdose, 85% of those were related to fentanyl. So really opioids, injection drugs are really the main driver in much bigger proportion than it is nationally in the representation.
Put that into perspective, for the decades before that, it was roughly 300 to 400 a year. So that's about where heroin fatalities were for quite some time.
Yeah, like, I mean, I think putting those stakes out there into perspective, like, it is the clearest illustration of a crisis, like of an urgent crisis that needs like a solution now into sight, right? Because like we're all journalists, we all write about this a lot, and the statistics kind of get numbing, and the so-called opioid epidemic and the overdose crisis, these are words that we see every day, and like what these words actually mean like get abstracted. And I think that's why like we're doing this episode and talking about this big win, because like the stakes could not be higher.
Totally. And we were expected this year to celebrate a reduction from an estimated 1,217 to about an estimated 1,150, which probably, is in a margin of error of account. And it's, a lot of people talked about how like a lot of the Narcan that was put out in outreach and was given away to folks on the street, mainly in Kensington, this neighborhood that is considered in many ways the epicenter of at least the visible crisis. But we got a reduction of like with all the efforts, all the money, STAR grant, SOR grant, whatever grant, all those stuff, like we reduced 70 deaths. So I think that the moral argument here, not that this is what we're talking about right now, but what is the excuse of not trying becomes really, really frustrating and becomes really, really important when just the death toll is so high and so sticky.
And maybe like we should just talk about, like why not try something like a supervised injection site, and sort of, I think, shedding, a bit of light on like why the move to sue Safehouse, like to bring them to court in like a civil suit, or to have like Rod Rosenstein out in the pages of the New York Times saying that they're going to go after people who try to do this. Like, it's cruel. I mean, it has like a tinge of cruelty to it. Like, cruelty is the point of sort of this administration, as sort of the slogan goes.
I would point out, and I don't think I'm disclosing anything that he probably wouldn't say publicly, but at least from Jose's perspective, this was the lesser of two evils, to take a civil approach rather than sort of just wait until they open and, just go in there and start pulling people out. It was probably the mildest of avenues if they were going to, pursue an avenue at all. That being said, the legal implications of a civil ruling, I don't know how tightly it's going to hold. Ultimately, Congress still has this law in the books. It applies to a proportion of the population, but I think it's an important step towards making this dialogue or elevating the dialogue into one that is now, in courtrooms among people outside just this niche of harm reduction that we spend so much time in.
And if I can add, just like taking like one step back on what do we mean when we say like there's this law in the books, and when we say like the judge exact ruling, and I think that's really critical to the point of the fact that we're not 100% sure what this means long term and why this is not over yet, is there's a lot of excuses to try to find legal reasons to prevent any activity, right? We know that in criminal courts every day people come in for something super minor they did, and they have it looks like a rap sheet. They, a prosecutor piled on them every charge possible. I think it's very similar to think about this activity in the same way. There's a lot of stuff that you can try to find and argue that it's illegal. And here, a judge found that a really specific, subsection of a law, that Krakow statute that you referred to, does not apply to what Safehouse explained in an evidentiary hearing that they're planning to do. That opens up, heroin possession is still a federal illegal under federal law. You can try to think about other legal excuses to go criminally against it. The question is solely on that use of the law against a supervised injection site. So the question again, when he says that he was still basically does not recognize this ruling, although he said when he announced originally the lawsuit, he said that he thinks that what needs to be done is to ask a federal judge if this is illegal or not, which he did, and he says no. But you can ignore past statements suddenly. Then yes, the question is like, what other tools exist out there to try and stop this from happening?
Right, and that's what we still think these are illegal, and like if you open one of these, we're still going to go after you. Like it sounds like, I don't know, that's very ominous. I don't know what tricks they have up their sleeve, but they're very clearly signaling that like this is not over and they're not backing down.
It's almost like they would do it just for the statement. I've talked to federal agents that don't have a personal problem with this. I've talked to beat cops on the street that actually support it. I think it's an image problem, perhaps, for an administration that fancies itself hard on drugs. And being the first at anything controversial certainly sets you up to be made an example of. I think that politics would play more of a role than outright cruelty. However, there are certainly people that care very little for drug addicted people. And let's be real, like specific. We're talking about a very specific subset of the drug using population that would use a facility like this. And so my question now to everyone I encounter is now, what would stop you from using a facility like this? To me, that's the interesting question. We just assume, if you build it, they'll come. But if you don't build it right, or you ask the wrong questions when they're coming through the door, they might not come back, right? It's going to be really interesting to see this experiment play out here.
I think it's worth noting that if Safehouse were to open, it won't be the first supervised consumption site in the United States. At least one already exists. It's just underground. There was this report on the first 4 years of operation, and like supervised consumption sites in the rest of the world, they had no fatal overdoses. So there's a lot of, it's so frustrating that this gets wrapped up in red tape when we have so much evidence that it works in other countries. There's no reason to believe it wouldn't work here. Why aren't we doing more to do this immediately? We have to argue about it so much more.
And not to like rant, but there's nothing that annoys me more than hearing. I do think that there are valid concerns of people, mainly because it's something new that they don't maybe understand fully, and there is a lot of easy access to misinformation to scare people about what a supervised site would look like. But I think that there's no argument that annoys me more than people saying, "Oh, it works in Canada, but America is not Canada. Philly is not Vancouver." Like it's mu receptor opioid, naloxone, mu receptor, like clear the receptor and be there in 4 minutes. Like that is not, naloxone does not work different when you cross a border. Like,
wait, I think I can top that, Av. What about it'll bring drug use to the neighborhood? Have you looked out your window lately?
Wait. When you flush a toilet in Philly, does it go right or go left? Because I hear that determines whether or not naloxone works.
Yeah, it's like, if not having supervised injection sites worked, then how do we have 1,100 people dying every year in Philadelphia when we don't have a supervised injection site? Like, I remember once Ryan McNeil, a great researcher that from Vancouver, tweeted about how like the opioid overdose death in Canada, in British Columbia, stayed the same or dipped a little. He just tweeted something like, "I guess we're out of bad policy ideas. We just did them all." And this is a little bit how this feels in Philly. Like we did everything wrong. We did it all. So it's really hard to imagine us, making it worse. It's kind of, hard to imagine, even if we didn't have literally hundred of peer-reviewed journal articles that show that this will work.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Chris, you're right. Like, it does go back to politics here. I mean, like, who had it on their, 2019 bingo card that during the Trump administration, there might be America's first supervised injection site opening? Not on mine. And I think,
Just look at the resistance to marijuana reform. I mean, even under Obama. So, I mean, and we still have policy being written by, well, now we've retroactively like adopted some of like the drug warriors that that created this whole mess in the first place. Yeah, it's astounding to me that we wouldn't just let this play out and see. If you're opposed to it, watch it fail, and then wag your finger, right?
And then another thing that really bothers me is that McSwain in court many times said to the judge in oral arguments, when Congress says no, it means no. And it's like, why are we having this conversation? If you want to have this, go to Congress, tell them to change the law, add an exemption, whatever. Like, we have medical marijuana dispensaries in Philadelphia. Want to talk about establishment that is built, rented, leased for the purposes of selling a Schedule I drug? How is a medical marijuana dispensary not exactly a literal violation of the crack house statute? But apparently when Congress says no, it doesn't mean no, because since was it in 2014, DOJ is not allowed to spend money appropriated by Congress to go after medical marijuana in legalized states. And for, what was it, like 6 years, 5 years, the Cole memo existed that they weren't allowed to go after recreational marijuana. So, and ever since the Session memo, we don't really see prosecutors going after medical marijuana, although they technically can.
Yeah, he's going to write the Weed House statute now.
I asked McSwain about that, and he kind of like punted the question, basically saying, let's see when it happens. But this idea that we don't have arbitrary enforcement of the law is a lie. And it's important, it's a lie in everyday life. It's not about like drug policy, right? So the idea that he has to, or any prosecutor has to go after this like one medical nonprofit is kind of ludicrous. And also it's like, kind of remember that the crack house statute's penalty is 20 years in federal prison for opening, for facilitating, while heroin possession is a year. That doesn't seem to make a ton of sense either, right? Like when we think about, do we actually believe that there's criminal, behavior here? Which the answer is obviously not.
And on the crack house statute, should we maybe talk about like who exactly would face that 20-year sentence were they to open? Like whose name is going to be on that lease, right? Isn't that like a huge part of this?
I think that's a great question, because I will say that I think if you take this in broad interpretations, and let me pull up 21 USC 856, but it's been a long few months, but because when you think about the word, for example, owner, lease, occupant, to rent, lease, for manufacturing, store, like it's so many words here, and there's so many verbs that like, one of them is even agent, owner, leasee, agent. So is the peer specialist that is, sitting there reading a book and, just has naloxone and maybe like greets people and hands out a syringe. Like, is that the person who technically, facilitated this drug use and suddenly faces 20 years in prison? So that's, again, I think that's like the disparity is a bit shocking. So you can think of it as basically a statute that can let you go after anyone from the owner itself, or, to perhaps if agent means, or occupant, or,
Well, I think that's perhaps part of the clarification that Rhonda was speaking about that I quote in my piece. And when I spoke to her last night, she had a very patient sort of, we're going to take this really slow, because I think that this ruling has made it clear that Judge McHugh considers, for the purpose of, to not apply to the operators that are going to save, or the medical personnel that would save lives, but this could still put drug users in jeopardy of a felony. And so, the question would come like, okay, so if it's not, if for the purpose of, is saving lives, that doesn't mean that the people that are there using aren't still guilty of a crime. So I think there was some concern in her voice about, disrupting the lives of people that are already disrupted, because that's the only avenue that might seem viable as a in law enforcement approach.
I mean, I would not put it past them or put it past law enforcement to, trail people who walk in and out of a supervised injection site. Like, they stalk methadone clinics, and if you drive up to a methadone clinic and get your dose and then leave, you get pulled over 2 blocks later. That's something that happens all the time. Why would a supervised injection site be any different? So yeah, I mean, I do think that it's a huge liability for any user is incredibly vulnerable. Were this thing to open, there would have to be safeguards. There'd have to be a lot in place to protect people.
And that's one that maybe you could speak to, but in my conversations, that's the question that has not yet been answered, is how will the police handle this? I mean, we lost Commissioner Ross, who went to Vancouver, who was at the press conference, who basically took the law enforcement lead on this. His replacement, I don't know much about. Maybe you do, but as far as I know, we have yet to receive any sort of protocol for how law enforcement would handle this. If there would be a perimeter, that was sort of off limits. So maybe you could shed some light into that. But that is a question a big question that still remains. But then anywhere in Kensington, you could stop somebody and probably find something on them most of the time.
Yeah, I was about to start with the latter. So listen, McSwain went to visit Prevention Point. Again, when we talk about, the law is the law is the law is the law. And it's important to remember that, unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, syringe exchanges do not have state authority. So when he went into Prevention Point, he went into an establishment that technically is violating state law. And he applauded that establishment in court multiple times. And he said, stop doing Safehouse, continue to doing the important work you do in Prevention Point. So I do think that it is interesting when you think about how, let me say this differently. When we think about the fears that people have about a supervised injection site, in many ways, they're describing areas in places like Kensington right now, right? Like a place where drug use is normalized, wherever that means, that it's done in public, that there will be congregations of people who are using in public, that there will be drop syringes. That is their reality. And if Philadelphia, and unfortunately I'm not, hoping for this, because we saw that in Boston, and this is not a good thing to do, but theoretically, if Philadelphia wanted to, and if they actually suddenly, the office of the Eastern District of Pennsylvania cared about drug possession, they don't really need Safehouse for that. And there was a moment that Chris, you alluded to earlier, there was a moment in the hearing that the judge kind of set up different scenarios to McSwain to see how he will respond, whether or not it violates the law. He said, what if someone has a kid, an adult kid, so not a minor? And he said, I know that you're using, I know that you're in addiction. I want you to stop using, but come use in my home. So I am naloxone, you'll be safe. And is that violation of the crack house statute? And McSwain is no, because the drug use is incidental. The purpose of this house is living there, and they want them to stop. And he's okay, so what if it's a van? And he said, well, it's not a violation if no one comes inside the van, but if it just parks next to a park, let's say, and you open the door and you look out, then it's not a problem. It's not a violation. It's not a violation.
And that is the scenario that actually was brought up independently, very early on, sort of very similar to that. There were so many little workarounds that people tried to come up with. really interesting to see that happen.
Like overdose stakeouts.
Yeah, basically. So then someone asked, what if there was a window? I don't remember if that was brought by the judge or by the Safehouse lawyer, but basically the argument was like, so what if there was a really big window outside of in Prevention Point that like had like a door, whatever, like a glass door, and Prevention Point gave you a syringe, the syringe exchange, and said, go use outside. I'm looking from here, but you're not on the premises, so there's no crack house involved, right? Is that a violation of 856 of the crack house statute?
What if there was a little cluster of people underneath a bridge by the Conrail tracks and harmonized people?
and they gave it a nickname, maybe a Spanish sounding nickname.
Yeah.
And it's just funny because those are exactly the things that the residents are so afraid of, right? But now we have the law and order prosecutor essentially advocating for public injection and for encampments because there's no ownership of property, so it's legal. So because it's only possession now, so he doesn't care. So in a weird way, you have harm reductionists trying to bring this in and remove, and I apologize for the use of word, but like this notion of like a nuisance, right? Like that it's on the street, not the people, but the fact that a street became a place where people are taking drugs. And you have the law and order harm reductionist, war on drugs warrior comes and say, no, stay outside. This is good. And the world is upside down and on fire.
It's great that you brought up Prevention Point because, like you said, it's not technically legal, just like cannabis shops are not technically legal. But the law can, make exceptions in that case. And it's not a big leap in logic to go from here, have this syringe. I know what you're going to do with it. You're going to inject drugs with it. Here, have it. At least it's clean. At least it's, And then you just kick them out. But providing a room in a syringe access program is not that big of a leap, Well, you're going to use this for this drug? Okay, well, why don't you do it somewhere I can watch you and I can make sure that you have naloxone and oxygen to revive you.
So actually, I think there's an argument to be made even that you would think if you try to reverse engineer the logic of a drug warrior, that it would be the exact opposite. That a syringe exchange would be a radical idea because you're allowing people to take something out and use it wherever they want. But a supervised injection site would be the conservative idea because you're controlling it. Like a methadone clinic is a conservative idea. And buprenorphine is the radical idea because you're taking it home. And like you can think about it as like methadone, that if for 3 months you are good enough, some states will allow you to take homes. You can think about almost like the drug warrior saying, let's have supervised injection sites and then the good ones can have take home syringes. So
you can make the argument it would keep syringes off the streets because they wouldn't be able to take them.
I mean, I definitely know people who are sort of, to the left even of supervised injection sites where they think that this is another form of surveillance, another form of control, like much like methadone clinics. And like, I get that. Like I get that feeling like, why would I want to walk into a private institution or a state-funded institution and hand over any information or whatever and do this activity? Like you're vulnerable, you're open to who knows what. And so I know people who don't like supervised injection sites for that kind of reason, but I think maybe we all agree that like with the right people running it, like people like Prevention Point or whoever, like they're not the state. They're not like it's not like when you walk into a cannabis dispensary that like I don't like handing over my ID. I'm like, what are you doing with my ID? Like, where's this information going? Like, is there like a database I'm going in? Like I don't like handing that information over. But that's why I think back to Chris, your point, like who is running this and what kind of protections are built in there, what kind of trust is built in there. Like it isn't really the case that if you build it, they will come. There has to be buy-in from the user community. Like that was a key takeaway from what I learned reading like Travis Lupik's book about the fight for supervised injection sites insight in Vancouver, is that without buy-in, without Vandu, like the the drug user union and organizing. Without them, no one would have used it.
And that's been really critical. And as I said, it's always my, how high on your list of priorities is overdose. What would prevent you from using, and there's cultural distinctions like that you wouldn't know if you weren't out on the street. There's a tradition among Latino users to hit each other. The service. Av, you know what I'm talking about. Presumably, this won't be allowed. There are people. There's people that can't hit themselves. There's females that have to be somewhat disrobed to be able to find a vein. I think that Prevention Point did it well. They would give you an anonymous number. I guess they kind of know who you are, but I don't know. I guess if somebody wanted to come in and start making lists, we're all fucked. But so yeah,
don't like registries. Not a fan.
The critique I hear is not so much like the Big Brother critique, but that it needs to be low barrier, right? So I've heard the critique that you don't need a doctor, really. Like that's just a waste of money. Peers and maybe a nurse practitioner or nurses are capable of doing that. That might just be, there's political viability, and one like treatment is a big one. Like we're clearly, this could not have happened if like we're offering treatment too. It wasn't a component of it. I don't believe we would be where we are necessarily. So yeah, the barriers to use, and it's a subset of the population that, hey, look, if you have a car, that there's a good chance you're still going to just not want to like go through the process, and you're late to work. You're not going to want to wait the 20 minutes or whatever. So those are things that'll come out, I suppose, as this goes on.
Yeah, I wrote a piece about talking to people around the world in places that have supervised injection sites or that tried and had issues, like in Mexicali, Mexico, and I thought that the experience from Ottawa, I talked to, and sorry if I am butchering the name, but with Taliesin Cahill, who is on Twitter. She's great, but she's a nurse and she works at a supervised injection site in Ottawa that is kind of similar to Prevention Point Safehouse in the sense that there it's actually in the same building. So now we're talking about a completely different facility, but it was the same building as the syringe exchange and the community health center. And there were a lot of relationships. So they expected that they would open the door on day one for the SIF consumption room and that there would be a line, out the door. And that definitely did not happen. And there was very low interest at the beginning. And one of the things that she told me that I thought was brilliant was that it's, and again, alcohol is so culturally prevalent that I think this might resonate with some folks who drink, but that usually you don't go to a bar because, you read a review or something. You go to a bar because a friend of yours told you that they went to that bar, and the crowd, and who are the other people who will go to that bar, and who you will meet in the bar, or who you won't meet at the bar. And kind of like it becomes a social habit in your world, in your social world, to go to that specific bar and not, one of 10 other sports bars that are kind of the same in every American city. So for her, it was the same kind of thing. There were the few brave first ones, and then there became a social component, a community that were like, this is okay. Like, you won't see that person here, or you won't, give this information. You won't be asked this question, or you will be comfortable. And questions about time, they became really busy, and suddenly they needed to say like how much time you can stay in your cube thing, and that could be an issue for some people who don't want to feel rushed or stressed. So I do think like we need to think about this as any social place with all the vulnerability that comes with it. And I also totally agree for Chris's point about the medicalization of it. So if there's generally can divide supervised sites to the social model and the medical model, I definitely think that this like medicalization of addiction and the disease model that you all covered so well and critically, it resonates. And I was in Dublin and I went to visit their site as they're building it, and it was the same thing. It was like, this has to be super medical. This has to be a tiny hospital, because if it won't be, people won't buy it. Like, this is how it has to be. And I think that's very similar here. If you talk about like the only person on staff is a peer support specialist, well, then is it a medical intervention? You know, when we talk about the cookies, you know, like, is that what we need?
And there's been a push to actually have this in a hospital here in Philly. And you're right. Is the sterilization of it, like, what it could be like a coffee shop with comfy chairs. You know, it doesn't have to be that way. But yeah, I suspect it will be maybe something in between. But hopefully there won't be men in white coats meeting you at the door.
Yeah, but like that white coat effect, though, I think that's like an actual real thing. Like, people definitely like trust their doctor, right? Like, but changing gears a little bit here. So like a lot of questions are like, now what? Okay, so we got this ruling. What happens now? And so I want to read a tweet from Jeff Deeney, who's also, you know, a Philly guy. And he tweeted out, you know, sort of like about the ruling and like what comes next. He said, quote, "My concern, which I stated prior to this last trial, is that the appeal takes the case to a more conservative branch of the circuit. I think the decision will be judge dependent. The government is hoping to pull a judge with the more favorable politics, and they may get that." So this is basically like, okay, so let's say they appeal and it goes to the Third Circuit, you know, that there could be really conservative judges on the Third Circuit. So, or the Ninth Circuit, which everyone thinks is like the liberal circuit. So yeah, like, what happens now is sort of an open question. And, you know, Chris or Av, I don't know, you know, where you're on that, what, you know, people in Philly are thinking about that.
I could go first on the mechanics of what happens next, and what happens next, according to Safehouse personnel, is that they need to clarify a couple things with the judge, and I did not press on what those issues were, and it's not necessarily going to be a formal clarification. It may take the form of just an informal phone call, and then where there was, I think, I was getting the feeling, and I believe even, you know, was told that there would, you know, there was an ability to open pretty quickly. I think there may be a bit of cooling off period, and then we'll see this. I would imagine, you know, operational certainly by the new year. There's also, I heard, well, I've been told, another site plan. So we're looking at 2 sites now, one in a different part of the city. On the legal question, I'll tip that to you.
Yes, I think it's a real question. First of all, what matters more now, the legal question or the community buy-in question? Because just like a police, you know, patrol or outside of a site can have a cooling effect that might make some people not go. Imagine if outside of the site looks like Planned Parenthood, and there are people every day outside protesting, right? Or just like taking photos of people walking in. And we saw that, right? We had like the Kensington Beach Instagram account. I don't know, you followed, like, this idea of people allowing themselves to take photos of people who are using or asleep or overdosed in Kensington is a real phenomenon. And so I think there's a lot of ways to make the site less effective, a site of law. On the exact question of the law, I think that it's hard. You know, the tea leaves of judges are super hard. It's important to remember that Safehouse had a whole other set of arguments of a religious component to, you know, they're doing this from a Judeo-Christian belief. There is a lot of, and there is case law that there are exemptions to federal law, federal drug law, based on religious belief, like the ayahuasca case. So I do think that there is a lot of openings for both liberal judges and conservative, especially libertarian. We know the Cato Institute is all in on this. And so I think it's hard. A lot of times I feel like the liberal judges are the ones who maybe are more willing to have, you know, the patronizing state for the purpose of this, like cliche, obviously, for the purpose of better health behaviors and imposing soda portion caps or whatever, right? And on the other hand, you can have sort of like a more libertarian judge that throws a bit of a you do you interpretation of drug law and the general footprint of the federal government on human behavior, that could be beneficial. So I really think it depends on kind of like super individualized judges. I don't think that there's a clear conservative versus liberal. And look at Pennsylvania. We have agreement between the Democrat that is Attorney General Josh Shapiro that is suing Trump every other day for something else as a part of like the hashtag resistance, who just came in support of recreational marijuana.
Yeah, he tweeted it out.
Never a dull state, the Keystone State here, never a dull day. And on the other hand, he's essentially in agreement with McSwain on federal law and supervised injection sites. So it's hard for me to know where we're falling. I think that McHugh is a very thoughtful judge, and when you read, there are parts of his opinion that are just like so thoughtful and like so like really show that he understood and captured exactly what they're trying to do. And so I think that would be the key. I don't think the political leaning of a judge will be what will determine this, but I think I genuinely believe that anyone who engages with the concept of harm reduction and genuinely engages with the evidence cannot believe that there is any criminal behavior here. I refuse to believe that. But I think there's a lot of judges out there that will not try.
But like also just imagine this going to the Supreme Court and them interpreting and thinking really hard about the crack house statute. Like that law is so vague, and like you said, it has all these verbs. Like it is honestly like the shittiest law like I've ever read. Like a fifth grader could write a better law than the crack house statute. Just like imagine like these brilliant
a fifth grader named Joe Biden.
yeah, exactly. Like imagine like these like brilliant legal scholars like taking their like critical legal eye to the crack house statute. It's almost a joke.
And the law is racist too. I mean, I think that's worth mentioning.
It's also racist against raves, which is bullshit.
No, but I think yes, the law is racist, but I think that the rave component is interesting. I think the law just represents, it's so vague that it's the perfect conduit for the moral panic of an era. So in the 90s and the 80s, it was crack houses and like, properties of Black people. And then in the 2000s, it was like parties, because that was the moral panic of the day. And then like now it's supervised injection site, and tomorrow they'll find a reason to apply that on like Juul or whatever, right? Because you find what you're panicking about and you apply the statute to.
Yeah, no, that's exactly like the perfect way to think about the crack house statute. It morphed into the Rave Act, and now it's being used against supervised injection. Yeah, it is like this weird mutated thing that, yeah, Joe Biden wrote in 1986. Like how this stupid law is still in play in our discourse is astonishing.
Well, fun fact, there's still a Carter appointee on the Third Circuit appeal. And I did forget this, but we don't want it to go before Stefanos Bibas, who was from, I believe, from the University of Penn.
Mm-hmm.
Who I wrote a scathing critique of a piece he wrote. He's like an extreme moralist on prison and prison reform, and basically thinks that he's in the old Dickens model of retribution and punishment and reentry and all that. So interesting. Other than that, it's like I've said. I mean, the free speech case that Dan Denver and I were plaintiffs on, the Mumia Act, the Mumia Abu Jamal, went before a Reagan appointee, I believe it was, to conservatives that should have been an affront, and that judge ruled appropriately. As a states' rights issue, you would hope that conservatives would buy in on that.
It is terrifying. I also think it's worth remembering that, like, as much as it's, easy to harp on, like, Trump appointee and Trump's DOJ and Rod Rosenstein, like, it's unclear to me what happens if a president, Booker, Buttigieg, probably not Buttigieg, but maybe Biden, obviously, or Harris is a Democrat in January 2021, takes over the White House. And it's unclear to me what that Justice Department does with this lawsuit. And I think that is something that is very disappointing on the left, that you do not see progressives, even though that, Warren and Sanders gave them their nod and one-liners in their policy papers. This has not become a rallying cry, even though, again, 1,200 of some of the most marginalized people in Philadelphia die every year.
Thanks for listening to Narcotica. You can follow us on Twitter at Narcocast or on narcocast.com. Narcotica is an independent production by Christopher Maraff, Zachary Siegel, and myself, Troy Farah. Our co-producer is Aaron Ferguson, who has just been killing it lately, and our theme music is by Glassboy. Additional music by Pictures of the Floating World. Narcotica is sponsored by Billy Bob's Big Long Slong-Shaped Bongs. Just kidding. That's a made-up product, I hope. In all seriousness, we don't want to clutter this program with stupid ads. So thank you so much to our Patreons who help keep this program free from corporate influence. We couldn't do it without you. If you want to help us out, join dozens of pro-drug advocates on our Patreon. Or help us get the word out. Give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts. We're finally on Spotify. Tell your friends about us, and carve our name into the bathroom mirror at Burger King. If you want to send us a suggestion, tell us about the medical benefits of cocaine, or just want to say hi, you can email us at tips@narcocast.com. That's all for now. Take care.